It's absolutely relevant. And these politicians are spinning what happened during the Bush period, during the Reagan period, particularly this Jay Carney. He's made a number of outrageous comments, and they repeat themselves, and so we get these big lies. So the middle class suffered, you see, because of tax cuts. And, of course, we know the middle class is suffering under Obama, and I'll get to that in a moment. Everybody wasn't alive during the Reagan period. A lot of people forget what happened under George W. Bush when he cut taxes. Also, there's this constant lying about Clinton's record, Clinton's policies. Clinton raised taxes and we had economic growth. I'm going to address all of this hour, all of it. So one of the things I try and do in this program is kick it up several notches on a substantive and intellectual point of view. So this is one of those hours. And in this regard, a great piece in Forbes, about a year ago or so, by our buddy Peter Ferrara. And the title of his essay is Reaganomics versus Obamanomics. And folks, this is really worth listening to because this is the contrast between efforts to promote free market capitalism and efforts to promote big government statism, liberty versus tyranny. And he points out that when Reagan entered office in 1981, he faced actually much worse economic problems than Obama faced in 2009. 3 worsening recessions starting in 1969 were about to culminate in the worst of all in 1981-82, with unemployment soaring into double digits, peaking at 10.8%. At the same time, America suffered roaring double-digit inflation, 11.3% in 1979, 13.5% in 1980. That's 25% in 2 years. The Washington establishment at the time argued that the inflation was now endemic to the American economy and couldn't be stopped, at least not without a calamitous economic collapse. Now, all of this was accompanied by double-digit interest rates, with the prime rate peaking at 21.5% in 1980. I want you to imagine all this going on today. The poverty rate in America started increasing in 1978, eventually climbing by an astounding 33%, from 11.4% to 15.2%. A fall in real median family income began in 1978, snowballed to a decline of almost 10% by 1982. In addition, from 1968 to 1982, the Dow Jones Industrial Average lost 70% of its real value, reflecting an overall collapse of stocks. You see, we have to go back to history for context, because if you listen to Obama and his mouthpieces, Jay Carney among others, you would think the economy at the end of the Bush era and the beginning of the Obama era were the worst. They were not. The Carter years were the worst. And when Reagan stepped into office, it was a disaster, and he had to deal with it. So what did he do? Reagan campaigned on an explicitly articulated 4-point economic program to reverse the slow-motion collapse of the American economy. First, cut tax rates to restore incentives for economic growth, which was implemented first with a reduction in the top income tax rate of 70% down to 50%, and then a 25% across-the-board reduction in income tax rates for everyone. Then the 1986 tax reform reduced tax rates further, leaving just 2 rates, 28% and 15%, the most revolutionary reduction of tax rates in modern American history. 28% and 15%. Reagan would have none of this talk about tax cuts for the rich and defending the middle class. His view was lower them all, cut them to 2 classes, period. Number 2, spending reductions. Yes, spending reductions, including a $31 billion cut in spending in 1981, close to 5% of the federal budget back then, or the equivalent of about $175 billion in spending cuts for the year today. In constant dollars, non-defense discretionary spending declined by 14.4% from 1981 to 1982, by 16.8% from 1981 to 1983. I'm not asking you, obviously, to memorize this stuff. I can't memorize it. But I'm trying to show you, even if you have a general understanding of this. What Reagan did, he slashed taxes and he slashed non-defense spending. In constant dollars, this non-defense discretionary spending never returned to its 1981 level for the rest of Reagan's 2 terms. Even with the Reagan defense buildup, which won the Cold War without firing a shot, total federal spending declined from a high of 23.5% of the GDP in 1983 to 21.3% in 1988 and 21.2% in 1989. That's a real reduction in the size of government relative to the economy of 10%. Number 3, Reagan pushed anti-inflation monetary policy, restraining money supply growth compared to demand to maintain a stronger, more stable dollar. See, and what's happening today is exactly the opposite. Massive printing. And number 4, deregulation. Deregulation saved consumers an estimated $100 billion per year in lower prices. In fact, Reagan's first executive order eliminated price controls on oil and natural gas. Production soared, and aided by a strong dollar, the price of oil declined by more than 50%. Now, these economic policies amounted to the most successful economic experiment in world history. The Reagan recovery started in official records in November 1982 and lasted 92 months. 92 months without a recession until July 1990, when the tax increases of the 1990 budget deal killed it. That was the George H.W. Bush and Democrat Congress tax increases, where he went back on his read my lips, no new taxes pledge. This set a new record for the longest peacetime expansion ever. The previous high in peacetime had been 58 months. Under Reagan, 92 months. Now, during this 7-year recovery, the economy grew by almost 1/3, the equivalent of adding the entire economy of then West Germany, which was the 3rd largest economy in the world at the time. In 1984 alone, real economic growth boomed by 6.8%, the highest in 50 years. Nearly 20 million new jobs were created during the recovery, increasing U.S. civilian employment by almost 20%. Unemployment fell to 5.3% by 1989 from its high of 10.8%. Real per capita disposable income increased by 18% from 1982 to 1989, meaning the American standard of living increased by almost 20% in just 7 years. The poverty rate declined every year from 1984 to 1989, dropping by 1/6 from its peak. The stock market more than tripled in value from 1980 to 1990, a larger increase than in any previous decade. And this is all dismissed as tax cuts for the rich. In the outstanding book, The End of Prosperity, by Art Laffer and Steve Moore, they point out that this Reagan recovery grew into a 25-year boom, with just slight interruptions by shallow, short recessions in 1990 and 2001. Now, they wrote, we call this period 1982 to 2007 the 25-year boom, the greatest period of wealth creation in the history of the planet. In 1980, the net worth assets minus liabilities of all U.S. households and businesses was $25 trillion in today's dollars. By 2007, net worth was just shy of $57 trillion. So adjusting for inflation, more wealth was created in America in a 25-year boom than in the previous 200 years combined. Now, what's so striking about Obamonomics is how it so doggedly pursues the opposite of every one of these planks of Reaganomics. Instead of reducing taxes, Obama is committed to raising the top tax rates of virtually every major federal tax. As already enacted into current law in 2013, the top 2 tax rates will rise by nearly 20%, counting as well Obama's proposed deduction phase-outs, which Boehner has gone along with. The capital gains tax will soar by nearly 60%, counting the new Obamacare taxes going into effect. The total tax rate on corporate dividends will increase by nearly 3 times. The Medicare payroll tax would increase by 62% for the nation's job creators and investors. The death tax rate will go back up to 55%. In his 2012 budget and his recent national budget speech, Obama proposes still more tax increases. Instead of coming into office with spending cuts, Obama's first act was a nearly $1 trillion stimulus bill. In his first 2 years in office, he's already increased federal spending by 28%, and his 2012 budget proposes to increase federal spending by another 57% by 2021. While the Reagan recovery averaged 7.1% economic growth over the first 7 quarters. You got that? It averaged 7.1% growth over the first 7 quarters. The Obama recovery has produced less than half, 2.8%, with the last quarter dismal. After 7 quarters of Reagan recovery, unemployment had fallen 3.3 percentage points from its peak, 7.5%. Not so with Obama. You see, capitalism creates wealth and prosperity and opportunity and jobs. Big government statism destroys them. And the article I referred to after the program, we'll have it on my website, as we have all articles and links on my website that we use. Now, that said, it's intended to give you a general impression. You had massive economic expansion and growth as a result of across-the-board tax cuts by Reagan in every category: corporate, individual, capital gains. Massive reduction in regulations. In other words, he was unleashing you, the American people, we the people, to create, to invent, to produce. And that's what you have to do. Obama's taken the opposite tack. So what they're good at the White House is propaganda. We're 4 years into this presidency, and they're still talking about George Bush. We're 4 years into this presidency, and Obama takes responsibility for nothing unless he can twist it and turn it into crediting himself for something he hasn't done. Jay Carney today at the White House. He gets into all this stuff. Let's start with cut 2, Mr. Producer, where Carney attacks the tax cuts. Cut 2, go.
Okay? Because after 1993, after that budget plan that was passed, we saw record economic growth. We saw record job creation. We saw the middle class strengthened and made more secure, and we saw vast amounts of wealth created in this country. In the aftermath of those 2 massive tax cuts in 2001 and 2003 that President Bush authored and then Congressman Boehner advocated, we saw stagnation for the middle class, we saw anemic economic growth, and then the worst financial crisis of our lifetimes, not to mention surpluses turned into deficits.
So you see, Jay Carney is a paid propagandist. And so he lies about history, and most of the reporters sitting there have no idea about recent economic history. None. Think about it a second. So tax increases created economic growth. Not only hasn't that ever happened, it didn't happen under Clinton, which I'll get to in a minute. And the Bush tax cuts created stagnation. That's absolutely false. And the Heritage Foundation wrote about this over a year ago. Favorite liberal argument is to attribute the economy's strong performance during the 1990s to Clinton's economic policies. Chief among them was this huge tax increase. Clinton signed his tax hike into law in September 93, the same year he took office. It included an increase of the top marginal tax rate from 31% to 39.6%. Repeal of the cap on the 2.9% Medicare tax. Applying it to every dollar of income instead of being capped to levels like Social Security. He added a 4.3-cent increase in the gas tax, an increase in the taxable portion of Social Security benefits, a hike of the corporate income tax from 34 to 35%, and much, much more. And that created economic growth? No, it didn't, as I will explain